What is sin? There are two primary types of sin, which we shall categorize as polarizing sin and equalizing sin. In order to understand sin, we must now approach the subject of STS and STO with precise understanding. The ultimate manifestation of STS, unabbreviated service to others through service to self, is the absorption of all consciousness into itself, taking the place of God by eliminating all resistance and competing consciousness units, thereby establishing itself as the one remaining being and absolute ruler over all of creation. All become one. The ultimate manifestation of STO, unabbreviated service to self through service to others, is the radiance of all consciousness into an infinite number of manifestations, taking the place of God by establishing itself as the source of all life, therefore facilitating the very existence of the unique experience of all beings. One becomes all. STO gives to all who ask, while STS takes from all whom it is able. Depending on the specific situation, the STS-STO archetypal manifestation can be expressed respectively in the following dualities: absorption versus radiance, decay versus creation, illusion versus truth, darkness versus light, bondage versus freedom, hierarchy versus equality, taking versus giving, subjectivity versus objectivity, and evil versus good. Another duality, matter versus spirit, can also be said to represent the dichotomy between STS and STO. However, STO does exist in the physical, specifically in 3D and 4D. This leads to an interesting situation where total polarization is not possible in the physical realm. STS cannot exist in the purely spiritual realms of 6D or 7D, because in order to do so, it would have to reconcile the idea that serving others is part of serving the self, that taking is only possible through giving, and that some must have freedom in order for control to exist. STS is so focused on the idea of self as God, on remaking the universe in its subjective image of perfection, that it cannot conceive of any value associated with the other side of the duality, which is seen as weakness. To do this would require it to relinquish its preoccupation with control and objectivity, consider the big picture, which would by definition make it an STS entity no longer. Similarly, STO cannot exist in its purest form in the physical densities, because it is constantly faced with the attempts by the STS collectives to impose domination and enslavement, particularly in the domains of taking versus giving and bondage versus freedom. When a highly polarized STO being gives to an STS being of equal stature, the STS being only takes, offering nothing but enslavement in return, which subsumes the STO being to the STS hierarchy, destroying freedom and the value of the STO polarity to the universe. Therefore, STO beings are forced to reinterpret the ideal and give selectivity in these situations, which provides an incredible catalyst for them to develop their individuality. But they are somewhat trapped by the battle until they attain the sublime wisdom required to ascend to the true spiritual realms. STS beings either obtain this wisdom and are transformed into STO beings, or they become so tyrannical and contractile that they cease to exist except in their own solipsistic self-reflection, and their consciousness eventually implodes into countless shards, the reflection of which regenerate as 1D elementary particles. Both paths, and only these paths, offer ways to find God. However, a total dedication to STS leads to a sort of spiritual dead end, forcing one to get recycled. It is with these understandings that we are finally able to approach the subject of sin. Upon entering 3D, the various preferences and idiosyncrasies of a particular consciousness will begin to pose the question of a higher calling beyond survival and society's definition of success. This is when the entity becomes interested in cosmologies and notions of good and evil. Further inquiry in this direction leads one to religions in various states of corruption and eventually to philosophical schools that seek to understand the essence of what religions purport to teach, some of which study the divine laws which govern creation as defined in answer 12 and 13. From this point forward, the entity is responsible for purifying itself in accordance to the side of the dualities which the school is aligned to. Or, if in the case he discovers the school is in opposition to his desired polarization, finding a school which is aligned to it. This is the point in which one discovers the STS-STO duality, which lies at the root of all other dualities, and polarizing sin becomes possible. All thoughts, words, and deeds which are opposed to the side of the dualities which represent the polarization one has chosen become sinful. Neutral actions are tolerated but discouraged. What is sinful for STO is generally not sinful for STS, and vice versa. Corollary truism is that sin cannot exist for an entity who is below the level of consciousness where the choice has any meaningful relevance, i.e. animals and low-level humans known as organic portals who are too biologically driven to have any quality of free will worth considering. This does not excuse them from the constraints of ethics. They are still unconsciously capable of great evil, which must be curtailed. It just means that from a theological standpoint, there is no presence of a consistent self to which sin can be assigned. A robot that malfunctions and kills a person cannot accumulate any sin because there is no soul present, as we understand it, against which sin can be accumulated. The greatest sin of all is ignoring the call of polarization and pretending it doesn't exist. In such a situation, the divine laws of the universe will continue to increase the pressure, suffering, and friction experienced between STS and STO until the non-committant consciousness either commits to a path or is disintegrated and shattered by the turbulence, causing it to start over from 1D and spend eons crystallizing a new 3D consciousness. In the case of extremely unresponsive species, this can even result in the destruction of entire planets. This is why the Bible describes those who know the word of God and cast it aside as the worst kind of sinners. It is unreasonable to expect polarization to occur without sins of a minor nature, because mistakes are often part of learning. However, one is expected to place their moral center of gravity on one end of the spectrum or the other, and define all lifestyle choices in that context. We will now touch on equalizing sins, which are not sins of polarity as much as violations of the divine laws, most often relating to the law of equilibrium and its relationship to the law of free will. This type of sin most often affects the 4D STS polarity, but it could affect 3D beings who possess great power as well. As a planet evolves and technological and cyclical advancements proceed, it becomes possible for one polarity to become completely dominant, such that no other choices are possible. This situation is actually a violation of the 7D directive, "Thou shalt create as thou chooses," and must be balanced by the law of equilibrium. Remember that the law of equilibrium requires that both polarities must be made available to all individuated denizens of all worlds, even if one only remains as a feeble potentiality. The only way to correct this particular imbalance is to remove the source of the imbalance, which results in intense suffering for the offending party who ignored this law, often leading to complete disintegration into primordial matter. The law of equilibrium is enforced by 6D STO and ensures that STS cannot lock an STO candidate into a reality where the STS polarity is sacrosanct. It also prevents 4D STS from engineering planets where polarization is impossible. We will conclude this discussion by stating that no being can pray for forgiveness or offer tithes or beg forgiveness to some supernatural entity or its intermediary as a way to absolve its sins. While others may be able to open some doors as co-creators with God, every conscious entity is responsible for purifying its own creation and reconciling it with the totality of creation.